A very pleasant good morning to all of you. We will start the workshop now. I'm very glad that you have decided to join us today for this dedicated technical workshop of ACER on future regulation on natural gas network, focusing on repurposing, decommissioning, and reinvestment of assets. My name is Cilla Bartók, and I welcome you on behalf of the gas market and energy retail team of ACER. I would like to sincerely thank and acknowledge the work of our consultants from DNV who helped deliver the study, and they will be mainly the ones introducing it today. We have published the study last week on the ACER website. Your presence shows how important this topic is in gas market regulation and its preparation for the energy transition. While we are waiting for the approval of the new hydrogen and decarbonized gas market package at the EU level, where discussions are very active around technical topics, there are also other discussions that are going on, looking at hydrogen readiness of networks, hydrogen standards. And this topic connects to all those technical discussions. This topic that we are discussing today is about asset regulation and how you should be preparing your networks for the energy transition. We also have guests from non-EU countries. I welcome them as well. We know that on global level this week is particularly active with the UN Climate Conference on COP27. And somehow this work of ours, although technically and maybe you would see distantly, but it does connect to that effort in practically reducing CO2 emissions. At this point, I would like to move to the housekeeping rules. And I hope you can see them as well. Just little technical problems here. But here they are. So as you can see, the meeting is recorded and it's posted on the event, and then we will post like all materials on the event page with the slides. It will be also, you can listen to the recording later on. Participants will be muted except for the speakers. And should you have any questions, please post them via MS Teams chat. Please include your name and affiliation in the question. And as you can see later, I will also present the agenda. There will be Q&A sessions where we would eventually address these questions. If we move on, here we go with the agenda. So as you can see, we will have three big parts in the discussion. Each three parts will be dedicated to different kind of problems relating to gas asset management. One will be dedicated to repurposing, another one on decommissioning, and the third one on reinvestments. The sessions are practically built up in the same way. So there will be a longer and comprehensive presentation from the DNV experts. Repurposing will be led by Daniel Grote, decommissioning by Weissum Steinborg Cheng, and reinvestments by Rosaria Nunez. We will have also some guest speakers who would reflect on these topics. ACM would reflect on repurposing, and Wietse van Bos will take the lead on that. On decommissioning, we will have Claude Mangin from ENSOG, and on reinvestment, Caterina Miriello from ARERA will speak. And after that, we will tackle the Q&As. It's very important, and we are very happy to announce that we will have also Benedikt Lauser and Markus Backes from the European Commission, who will join us and would offer us some introductory remarks, mainly related to the upcoming decarbonization package. I will also have Miguel Martinez by my side, and he will help introducing the DNV study, as well as he will be very active participator in managing the question and the stakeholder discussions. With that, I'm passing on the floor to you, Miguel.
Thank you, Cilla. Good morning to all participants. It's good to see you all here. I will provide, I think I'm here a first slide, an introductory slide to the presentation and to the study that we're here discussing today. I hope this can serve you a little bit to guide yourself through the presentations today, and also maybe give you a hint of what questions you could bring also to the chat. This work actually started almost 2 years ago, so that was before the scenario that we're currently in related to the war in Ukraine. And it started as part, very closely related to the implementation of the tariff network code as part of, or as an extension to some of the work that was done there, particularly on tariffs and on allowed revenue. And what we looked at there was to the 2050 decarbonization objectives, and it was evident that this targets would imply to some extent a decrease in natural gas demand, which trigger a number of changes in the network, in the gas networks. And to understand the changes that and the impacts that these policy targets would have on natural gas networks, we identified back then three key topics, which Chila has already introduced, which are repurposing, decommissioning, and reinvestments. Repurposing would take place typically when natural gas assets are removed from natural gas networks to make them available for transporting hydrogen. Decommissioning and also variations in tariffs were also relevant because decreases in natural gas consumption and use or transport could potentially render some assets unutilized or potentially stranded, and they could also lead to increases in network tariffs. And then finally, the last point that was relevant was reinvestments, because we will continue to see investments in these networks, either in the form of asset extensions or asset replacements for assets that become fully depreciated and have to be removed or replaced. And these three things or topics are greatly related, and I think DNV will give you will explain throughout this workshop, and also in the report you will be able to see how the links are very uh, clear. This work was also done, so it was planned 2 years ago, but DNV has been working on it for the last year, and it also has taken place in parallel to the discussions on the gas decarbonization package. And here you see a number of elements that are close, like for example, the repurposing of natural gas pipelines, or also the forecast of tariffs ahead into the future. So these things that are already there are the study already reflects on them. The aim of the study is firstly to table these topics. We understood when we started thinking about them that there was very little discussion on them, and we thought it was important to kick these discussions up. And then we will see that perhaps these topics could, or this study could influence also the current discussions on the gas decarbonization package, although marginally, because they're at quite an advanced point. But they will for sure be relevant when implementing the different tasks that are laid out in this package. We see that this study has already been had an impact on ongoing tasks, such as in the implementation of the 10E. And maybe just a quick disclaimer, I think this study, while it refers to the decommissioning and repurposing, it does not try to assess the likelihood or the extent to which these changes in the network will take place. What this study provides are the instruments to address these changes, and also a number of instruments which we can already start using to limit the risk that we might be facing in the transition, to smoothen this process as much as possible. I think that's an interesting graph that you see in the bottom left of this slide, and DNV will present it throughout the presentation. I think with this, you should have a framework to already see what we will be discussing. And without further ado, I would like to pass on the floor to our colleagues from the Commission, who very kindly have accepted our invitation to present. Marcus.
Yes, thank you, Miguel. You already covered some parts I want to refer to, but let's take a look, giving a short background and framework why this study is also important in light of the proposed gas package. Recapping, there are 5 principal policy aims that we try to achieve with our proposal that was published mid-December last year. So in a very different context that we are in now. but the policy aims remain up to date. So one of the key aspects is the integration and the facilitation of access of renewable and low carbon gases. So to enable the transition to reach carbon neutrality, also on the methane side, not only on electricity, but also on methane side, and also on the side of other gases, mainly being hydrogen. For that, we have the second policy objective, the dedicated hydrogen infrastructure and the ramping up of the hydrogen market, for which rules are contained in the proposed package. A third key policy objective is network planning, and I think this is one of the key objectives which links to the study here, because I will go into details later on what or how this is linked to decommissioning and repurposing. And then we have policy aim 4 and 5, which are focused on security of supply and consumer protection. Security of supply is also a little bit related to our topic here, because even if network utilization is reduced in the future due to a change of consumption, we still have, for example, the N-1 principle of the gas ACER regulation in place, meaning that the network or the network configuration also needs to be resilient to provide or to be able to match supply and demand in any kind of situation. Now, I think I will actually skip that slide. You can take a look later on the ACER website. But in principle, it provides a little bit more insights into the key changes within the methane, so the classical gas network rules. But let's focus a little bit more in detail on the network planning aspects. The proposal, and here I'm talking about Article 51 to 53 of the directive, does several things. It creates for the first time an obligation for all the TSOs in the member states, irrespective of how they are certified. So irrespective of whether they are I2, ISO, or ownership unbundled TSO, sorry, to work on a national network development plan. And for doing so, they should base that work on a joint scenario, which also includes the relevant actors of the electricity side, but also potentially hydrogen operators and LNG and storage operators, as well as distribution system operators. And why is this integrated network planning important in relation to the study? Well, because we want to have transparency on not only on what investments will be required, but also on what part of the network could be decommissioned and could be potentially repurposed. And this is important for the next slide, for which I will hand over to Benedikt.
Thank you, Marcus, and good morning. My name is Benedikt Klauser. I'm part of the team at DG Energy working on the new rules for dedicated hydrogen infrastructure. And so in addition to the elements that Marcus laid out in as regards the Commission proposal, I wanted to draw your attention to two additional elements which will directly affect asset regulation, and in particular in terms of the aspects which are examined in the study when it comes to repurposing and also asset transfer. And so these both will have an impact on the regulatory background and let's say context in which the rollout of hydrogen infrastructure will take place. And obviously, efficiency will be key, both in terms of the dimensioning and location of future hydrogen grids, but also when it comes to the speed at which we can develop this new infrastructure to prevent a situation where the lack of transport infrastructure would hamper and impede the market growth on future hydrogen commodity markets. And that takes me to the two elements that I wanted to highlight. One being rules on permitting, which are set out in Article 7 of the directive proposal. And so this article contains rules on the streamlining of permitting for the construction and operation of new hydrogen infrastructure, both for electrolyzers and network and storage infrastructure. So here we have rules that will hopefully reduce the overall time which is required to obtain permits for these types of infrastructure. And it also includes in paragraph 7 and 8 rules on grandfathering of permits when natural gas infrastructure is repurposed for the transport of hydrogen. So this should also speed up the process of repurposing and subsequent use of current natural gas assets as hydrogen transport means. The second element that I wanted to highlight are rules on the regulatory asset base, which you find in Article 4 of the regulation proposal. And these rules are important in a number of ways. Firstly, they enshrine the principle of separation of regulatory asset bases, which effectively already applied to gas networks and electricity grids based on the rules on tariffication that we have for those. But when it comes to hydrogen networks, to pure hydrogen networks, there were no rules in place until now. And the proposal envisages to set out very clearly that the separation of regulatory asset bases is the default principle when it comes to asset management between different types of networks. The rules do allow for limited cross-financing between different network types, but they do so under very strict conditions and subject to regulatory approval. And from among these conditions, I would in particularly mention two, which is the fact that cross-financing, for example, between gas networks and future hydrogen networks can only occur on a temporary basis. So the financial transfers between different regulatory asset bases has to be limited in time. And secondly, it cannot affect cross-border trade. That means that any levies or charges used to cross-finance other networks can only be levied on domestic exit points, cannot be charged to interconnection points used for cross-border flows. And finally, this article also clarifies that when it comes to a transfer of asset bases in the context, transfer of assets between different regulatory asset bases in the context of repurposing, for example, then this transfer itself must occur in a way that it does not lead to cross-financing to cross-subsidies. So, as I said, these rules are of particular importance when it comes to the regulatory context for repurposing and for the rollout of hydrogen infrastructure. To end my presentation, I want to underline, of course, that these rules are still at the negotiation stage. They're being discussed in Council and Parliament, so they may still be subject to change when it comes to the final outcome of the package. And yeah, Marcus and I will be happy to answer questions, but understand we'll do so at the end of the first session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benedict. I think that was a very helpful presentation. It actually links very well to the next section on repurposing, which Daniel will be presenting. Also, I believe he will provide an introduction to the whole study. And I think we're a few minutes behind schedule, but I think I would like to inform that we will respect the times allocated for each presenter, just so you know. Okay, Daniel, so thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Also welcome from our side to this workshop. So in the following, we will present the key findings of our study that we just completed for ACER. We'll start with providing further background on the topics discussed in our study and why they are relevant. And then we'll go into further detail in the three main topics relevant for the future regulation of natural gas networks in the context of decarbonization, as has been mentioned. So it's the repurposing, decommissioning, and reinvestments. So to start with, natural gas networks will in the future be increasingly affected by decarbonization policies and energy transition. And you see here the latest ENSO TYNDP scenarios, showing different scenarios for the future development of demand and supply for methane in Europe until 2050. And reflecting European national decarbonization policy targets, these scenarios, as well as those of other forecasts that have been done by other entities, all point out to a permanent and significant decline of natural gas demand in the future. And this will have further implications, of course, for the utilization of natural gas networks for the transport of natural gas in the way that the volumes of natural gas transported over these networks can be expected to shift and decline in the future. Now, it's as also Miguel mentioned at the beginning, it's important to point out that we have not done any modeling on the future development of supply and demand of different gases, as well as on the future need of pipeline capacities as part of this project. But the focus has really been on the regulatory aspects of decarbonization for natural gas networks. While there's still a lot of uncertainty on the future development of energy demand and supply, we can, however, expect that part of the current natural gas demand will over time be replaced by renewable gases, such as biomethane or hydrogen. And part of the natural gas demand, the current natural gas demand, will possibly be substituted by electricity and also energy efficiency. So for the future use of individual natural gas network assets, this essentially means that there's three general options. They may be repurposed and used for the transport of hydrogen. And different work has been done on the technical feasibility to do so, such as in the Restream study that was conducted by DNV and Carbon Limits, that is shown here on the left side of the slide. Then they may continue to be used for the transport of methane, which may shift from natural gas to biomethane or other synthetic gases in the future, which may require then also decisions on reinvestments and the extended use of these assets. And also it could be the case that part of the infrastructure may not be further used and may be eventually decommissioned. When this change will happen and how relevant each case will become in the future is, of course, still very much uncertain. Also, as we see just this year, with the war in Ukraine happening, which also definitely had an impact on the whole natural gas infrastructure. But given the capital-intensive nature of natural gas networks, and the long asset lifetimes. It's however important that the regulatory questions related to all these three topics, so related to repurposing, decommissioning, and decisions between replacement and extended use of assets, are already picked up now in the regulatory frameworks. Assets which would be withdrawn from operation before the end of their regulatory asset life do face a potential risk of stranding. That is, if they are not repurposed for the transport of hydrogen, of course. The figure here on this slide illustrates the potential risk of asset stranding. It's based on TSO data, which was collected by ACER from the national regulators as part of the study. And it shows the future evaluation of the aggregated regulatory asset base of all European natural gas TSOs, not including any future investments. Data on future investments could not be provided. So it's basically showing the future evaluation of the current assets as they are. As you can see, it indicates across all countries a large part of the current aggregated regulatory asset base will already be depreciated in the next 20 years. And depending then on the development of the future demand for methane and the extent of repurposing, this may raise then questions on the regular treatment of reinvestment and extended use of assets beyond their regulatory asset life. So if you see, the assets are already depreciated, but they are still used for the transport of gases, then also the question comes up on reinvestment, which has to be tackled. It also indicates that a relevant share of the current aggregated regulatory asset base may not yet be fully depreciated by 2050. So if these assets then are not further repurposed for the transport of hydrogen or used for the transport of biomethane, they could potentially face a risk of stranding. Now looking at data for individual countries, without giving any names to specific countries and TSO, we do see that individual natural gas TSOs and countries may face quite different potential risk of stranding in relation to the decline of natural gas demand, which obviously reflects the differences in average asset age, in the regulatory asset lives and the regulatory depreciation policy. But you see for some countries, quite a significant share of the current regulatory asset base will only be depreciated after 2050. Coming back to the study and our reports that we have provided. So overall objective of our study has been to analyze the regulatory challenges and possible regulatory solutions for repurposing, decommissioning, and reinvestments of natural gas transmission assets in the context of decarbonization and the decline of natural gas demand. And it's important to stress that in our study, we did in general analyze the regulation of natural gas transmission, but not of natural gas distribution. And also, we did not look in detail on the regulation of hydrogen, but really focusing, in this study on the regulation of the natural gas networks. Furthermore, in line with the European gas decarbonization package that was mentioned also at the beginning, and the views also of ACER and the national regulators, we also did assume the application of at least accounting unbundling between natural gas and hydrogen network operators when discussing different regulatory options. In our report, we analyze each of these three topics, so repurposing, decommissioning, and reinvestments by the following structure. The first, we discuss the regulatory challenges or questions. We then describe the current situation and practices in the European Union, and then go into further detail, which is also at the core of the report, on the regulatory options and methodologies that there are to address these challenges. And finally, then we provide also specific recommendations in each of these areas. As regards on the main inputs of our study, we conducted an extensive literature review, a number of case studies. There were 2 surveys conducted. One included all national regulatory authorities in the European Union, and one was targeting a number of stakeholders. Then we also had additional bilateral calls and meetings with a number of regulators and natural gas TSOs. As part of the project, TSO data was collected by ACER from the national regulators. And of course, then we have our own D&D analysts that fed into the further assessment. Now getting more specific on the topic of repurposing. First of all, it's probably good to mention how we have defined repurposing in our context. So it relates to the conversion of individual natural gas network assets for the transport of hydrogen and the transport of an asset from a natural gas to a hydrogen network operator. The regulatory questions in relation to repurposing can essentially be grouped in 4 areas that we show here on this slide. So first, it's about the identification of individual natural gas transmission network assets to be repurposed, which relates to regulatory provisions on when individual assets should and are allowed to be repurposed, how the assessment should be done, how they should be, the identification of these assets should be conducted, who should conduct this assessment, should it be with a natural gas TSO or the regulator, and generally what should be the role of the regulator in this process. Is there some regulatory approval for any assets that's going to be repurposed? And further question that we have also looked at in our report is the choice among alternatives. So when the natural gas TSO, when there's parallel pipelines or alternative pipelines that can be repurposed, and how to make a choice between those 2 assets. Then another important question and topic in the context of repurposing, obviously, is the transfer value. So that's the price at which, or the value at which the asset is going to be transferred from a natural gas to a hydrogen network operator. Obviously, as was indicated by the European Commission, there's quite some provisions in the proposed decarbonization package, which may limit the freedom here in that demand or in this area. But basically, this transfer value could be either an outcome of a negotiation between the natural gas TSO and the hydrogen network operator, or it should be, or could be determined within the regulatory framework. That's a question then, who does then the actual calculation of the asset transfer value? And should it be a calculation for each individual specific individual assets that are going to be repurposed? Or it's also possible to think of some average asset value that's been calculated, which would simplify the individual transfer process. And then also, of course, it's a question whether to use the residual asset value in the natural gas regulatory asset base, or to apply a different methodology for the purpose of the asset transfer value. And furthermore, then that's, when determining this value, also a couple of things can be considered or not. So it's about any repurposing costs that arise to the natural gas TSO. So that can be costs related to the technical feasibility studies, but there's a number of more costs, and we'll get to that also on another slide. Then it's a question on any revaluations of the assets that have been taking place in the past, to what extent they should be considered in this transfer value. And of course, one could also think on the future hydrogen value So the value of the specific assets for hydrogen network operator may be different than to the natural gas network operator, which could possibly also relate to the fact that different capacities are needed on a specific route by the hydrogen network operator than by the natural gas network operator. And finally, another element here is also, of course, once an asset is going to be repurposed, then there's essentially no risk of stranding left. And depending on to what extent this risk is and should be reflected in the remuneration of the natural gas TSO, that may then also be reflected in the transfer value. Then third question that's to be discussed here in the context of repurposing is the allocation of costs and revenues that relate to this asset transfer. So especially when there's any differences between the residual asset value and the asset transfer value, then it can either be allocated to the natural gas TSO or its asset owner, or it can be allocated to the natural gas network users. But it's also, of course, possible to share it with both of them. Also then again, reflecting if there's any repurposing costs on the natural gas TSO side that come on top of the residual asset value, then of course that also would create then a difference which has to be somewhat allocated. And finally, fourth area, which is also we think important to look at and also to provide there some regulatory guidance, is on the procedure to transfer assets. So that's on provisions of documents, data, and information that's to be shared with interested hydrogen network operators that are considering to acquire a natural gas network asset, to give them the possibility to do that some evaluation. It's about the treatment of costs for the separating of assets and organization. So then we have there different natural gas and hydrogen network operator, then staff will move and IT infrastructure and lots of things, organizational processes needs to be separated, which come as additional costs. And it's also a question on the allocation of cost in case there's a joint treatment of assets, a joint use of assets, and or there can be assets which maybe need to be split. Some stations in the natural gas and hydrogen network, which are both used by pipelines from both sides, then it's the question on where exactly to split individual assets. Then getting to one of the first questions, so when to repurpose and how to assess the situation. First of all, repurposing should take place when there's a need for the transport of hydrogen, of course. It needs to be determined that it's technically feasible. And if those two criteria are met, then it's about the question whether it's operationally possible, which relates to two possible options. Of course, if the individual network asset has dropped permanently to zero, its utilization, so it's not further used at all. Or it can be the case that there is some residual use, but it can be shifted and covered by other pipelines or routes. Then, of course, it's also possible to repurpose that asset. Then question is then how to do this assessment. General recommendation is to do that in the context of the network development plans, which then need to be adjusted and expanded in a number of ways. So to enable the natural gas TSOs or to the natural gas TSOs should actually then provide detailed scenarios on the regional distribution of natural gas demand and supply. There should be an analysis and detailed reporting on the future utilization of individual assets. Analysis should be done on the possibility to shift residual utilization. And then finally, it's also about an analysis of possible impacts of repurposing when there is a need or an interest for the transport of hydrogen already identified, or when there's already decisions taken or pre-agreements being concluded on the repurposing and transfer of assets. Then according analysis and assessment should be conducted as part of the natural gas network development plan. There should be a close coordination with also the network development plans for hydrogen and electricity. That's in the context of the network development plan. Of course, there may be a number of smaller repurposing projects that relate to the small assets, where the size of the repurposing project may be small and the number of affected users or the volumes may be small. In that case, it could also and should be considered to do some assessment according to some guidelines, regulatory guidelines outside of the network development plan. This should be particularly done when there's this repurposing does not affect the availability of individual entry or exit points of the natural gas transmission network, or when the impact on reliability and security of supply is not significant. Then finally, the regulator should then review the repurposing projects as part of its review and approval of the network development plan. And we know in some countries, regulators do currently not approve the network development plans or in a position to make adjustments or request adjustments to the network development plan. So that's something that should be given, that they have this authority and power to formally review and approve, which is also something which is foreseen in the further regulation that's been discussed. Then there's also another situation where it could be considered to enable repurposing. So again, we have the need for hydrogen transport. It's technically feasible. And then we have a situation where there's a very low residual use of an individual natural gas pipeline that cannot be shifted to another pipeline. But repurposing would provide an economic net benefit. So that's when you compare the cost of building new hydrogen infrastructure and then the cost that would arise to the residual very low natural gas use of an asset and the impact it has on the residual users. Then from a welfare or economic perspective, it may be efficient to discontinue the use and enable a transfer. Because otherwise, if you were to wait until the last molecule for the transport of natural gas has left the pipeline, then you would basically limit repurposing to situations where there's parallel pipelines or where exit points can be served by alternative routes, which may be in some countries that are characterized by quite a lot of parallel pipelines and infrastructure. So that's maybe not an issue there, but some of the natural gas transmission networks in some countries, that would then significantly limit the possibility to repurpose if you have to wait until the last natural gas user has then left the system. Now, in this case, what assessment should be conducted? That should come with a cost-benefit analysis, which should compare the costs and benefits of repurposing of that individual asset with the construction of new hydrogen network infrastructure. The CBA should be conducted jointly by the natural gas and the hydrogen TSOs, or in this initial phase, when we do not have yet hydrogen TSOs, that should be That should be then conducted by the natural gas transmission operator. The CBA methodology and its parameter should be defined in the regulatory framework and guidelines. Again, it's then the regulator that should then review and correct the application of the CBA by the natural gas TSO. Then, of course, in this situation, may conflict with current obligations that are in the regulatory framework, which have an obligation of network operators to connect everyone that wishes so. That would be then something that would need to be changed. And of course, then, if there's residual use, which then cannot be met, that may either lead then to a disconnection of some of the users. Then it's about, then it's also important that some compensation of this affected users is in place. So there may be disconnection, there may be reconnection needed to other existing remaining natural gas network assets, or there may be also significant impacts on the reliability of supply for these users. So then it needs to be discussed how to compensate these users. Okay, then another topic to look at that I already mentioned are the different costs that arise to the natural gas TSO in the context of repurposing. So it's assessment of the technical feasibility and adaptation needs. There may be additional costs arising to investments conducted by the natural gas TSO that enable already hydrogen readiness. There may be situations where an asset is not actually further used for the transport of natural gas, but not yet the hydrogen need has occurred. So they may be put and kept in a mothball status and for later repurposing, which may also come at additional costs for the natural gas TSO. And then I mentioned already the separation of assets and organization.
Daniel, just one point. We should hurry up a bit because we have about 5 minutes left.
Okay. Yeah, then I'll close here quickly. So again, this cost, if they're efficient, necessary, if there's a need for the transport of hydrogen, and if they're not already covered by state aid or subsidies, then they should be considered in the allowed revenues of the natural gas TSO. And when attributed to individual network assets, or also then you could think of a pro rata basis, they should also be considered in the asset transfer value. Then maybe quickly, then the last topic I wanted to mention here in this presentation is asset transfer value. Our recommendation is to first of all adopt clear regulatory rules on the determination of that value, so that it's based on regulatory guidelines, and the residual asset value of the natural gas regulatory asset base should serve here as a reference value. And additional repurposing costs that we have mentioned that arise to natural gas TSO should be considered. And then if that's feasible in the regulation, then it's possible that the natural gas TSO and the hydrogen network operator then agree on if there's good reason to do so on a higher or lower asset value based on this reference value. Okay, and again, then that's determination should be with natural gas TSO based on regulatory guidelines, and if there's any deviations, potential deviations between the residual asset value and the asset transfer value, then a sharing mechanism should be adopted, how this difference is going to be shared. Maybe with that, I conclude this presentation.
Thank you, Daniel, for your very detailed review. I think the report is even more detailed. I'm just telling the participants, and in case they want to dig deeper in any of the topics. I would like to pass the floor now to Wietse from ACM, the Dutch NRA, and he will provide us with a very interesting presentation because it's probably the only one, or together maybe with Germany, one of the few member states where we have dedicated legislation and where the process is a bit farther in regards to repurposing. So we look forward to this presentation. Wietse, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First, thanks to Daniel for the interesting presentation. Lots of interesting things to think about. But in the Netherlands, we're sort of already having to start on thinking about this topic. Reason for this, lots of parties in the Netherlands see lots of opportunities for a hydrogen backbone, as it's called here. Reasons for this, I think the reasons are probably similar in almost all countries, especially in the Netherlands. We have a very dense and large methane network, and the projected gas flow is projected to go down massively. So we expect lots of space in our pipelines. Because of this, there are plans have been in the making to make a hydrogen network in the Netherlands, and the plan is to have a backbone, as you can see on this image, in the Netherlands. By, I think, 2030, it's planned to be completed. A significant part of this backbone, you can't really see it clearly, but the orange parts here can be used, according to the natural gas TSO, can reuse assets that are currently owned by the methane TSO. And because they want to be finished with the entire backbone in the Netherlands by 2030, they're planning to start with the first investments rather quickly. I think the first new pipelines are already being built as we speak, and the first asset transfers from methane towards hydrogen are expected to start probably next year. So different parties, the methane TSO, the hydrogen TSO, market parties, the ministry, we're all thinking about how should this asset transfer work. Then what's the role of the ACM here? Our formal role is very small. All the regulation around the backbone is really in the ministry, and the asset transfer that's going to take place, our formal role here is quite limited. There aren't really any laws dictating what we can and cannot say here. The only thing we thought we could do is really use our expertise as someone who knows the market, who knows the gas TSO, knows a bit about hydrogen, to give a sort of informal advice on which transfer value we deem acceptable. This does come with sort of the ACM, I think, as most regulators, are respected by different parties. So people do listen to us, but it's not a formal rule that we can implement. So what we did, we started a consultation process on how should this asset transfer for repurposing happen. We talked to different market parties, from people involved in hydrogen to the people only involved in the methane network. And in the consultations, we really found widely diverging views. Some parties were thinking, hey, these assets aren't being used by the methane people anymore. Let's give them away for free. Others were, the alternative is building a new pipeline, so the price should be based on the new pipeline value. Values in between were also discussed. The ACM took all these views from consultations into account, and eventually we came to the conclusion that a price based on the remaining asset base is desirable. So essentially, we just look at how much did the gas TSO pay for these pipelines, how much has the gas TSO already been paid in tariffs to get the money back from these assets, and the remaining value is, according to the ACM, a reasonable transfer value. Because of specific, basically convenience reasons, the gas TSO and the hydrogen TSO have also been talking about an average price. What they do there is they take the total RAB value of the entire network and the total length of the network in kilometers. Then they calculate a value, an average value per kilometer. We also discussed this. We talked about this in the consultations and in our vision document, where essentially we concluded we prefer the more specific, the more accurate, specific RAB of the assets being transferred. But if it's more convenient for subsidy reasons or things like of that nature, the practical side, an average price can be acceptable if the average is still based on the RAB value. That's in a very brief nutshell our conclusion here. Other small details we mentioned, if there are costs associated with cleaning up the pipelines, making them hydrogen ready, in principle, the hydrogen operator will need to bear those costs. I think that's also a key point which most people in the consultation also agreed with. Like I said, this is an informal piece of statement from the ACM. We don't really have a formal way of enforcing these asset transfers, but this is what we advised. The result is yet to be seen. First asset transfers are probably expected to come next year. We expect that our advice will at least be taken seriously, and we're very interested to see how this develops. That's a very brief introduction to what we have done at the ACM.
Thank you, Wietse, for that presentation. I think it actually during the run up to this study, it was also we had some discussions on this work that your NRA has conducted, and I think the report, the study reflects on them. I'd like to maybe bring three questions that we have from the chat, both to the Commission and also to DNV. The first one that I am referring to is by Megan Anderson, and it refers to the unbundling, the accounting unbundling conditions between hydrogen and gas operators. So maybe to the Commission, I would like to just ask if there is any news on that, and to DNV, I would like that they maybe can make explicit what their choice to consider how to consider unbundling in the report. And then maybe I have two short follow-up questions for DNV, because we've seen from ACM that they referred to the residual asset value as the value to transfer assets. I think we have some experience, or DNV has had some experience looking at the easiness of establishing the residual asset value. There's some specific conditions that are referred to in the report, so they could refer to that, and maybe briefly to the incentives for TSOs to selling assets for repurposing. That's also for DNV. We have about 5-6 minutes for these questions, so I give you the floor. Benedict, please.
Thank you, Miguel, and thank you for the question. Well, as I said, the negotiations are still ongoing, but in principle, what the package envisages is that, of course, the principle of accounting unbundling, which has been in place for decades now, continues to apply and will also apply to hydrogen infrastructure. And then on top on that, we have a special requirement of legal separation between hydrogen networks and other types of energy networks within an undertaking within a given group. This is a purely legal requirement of basically creating a subsidiary or a separate company within the group structure to contain hydrogen assets and hydrogen network operation activities. There's no functional unbundling. There's no requirements to have separate governance or decision-making processes. It's a requirement of legal unbundling that serves to ensure the transparency of financing and accounts. This is what is envisaged in the proposal. I can't, of course, say what will be in the final outcome in the final package.
Yeah, maybe also to reflect from our side. So basically, yeah, that's was an assumption to take on the unbundling when assessing the regulation. Yeah, of course, then particularly when it comes to network or system planning, if that's an integrated company, then that would be internalized, which then would have further synergies. Then yeah, also as how things develop with different hydrogen networks, at least in some countries. Yeah, then there's maybe also some arguments on applying there some regulation. Yeah, what it would change, I'm not sure actually how much that would kind of really yeah, impact to some of the regulatory recommendations. Of course, then you wouldn't have a yeah, discussion on a transfer value, because there is no transfer of assets that would stay within a company. But yeah, I guess one key element to be discussed here, if all hydrogen network users would be former natural gas users, or the other way around, that all natural gas network users would eventually become hydrogen network users, then yeah, then it's probably more straightforward. But assuming that also some natural gas users will eventually yeah, switch to alternatives and not becoming part of the hydrogen network, then you could yeah, at least discuss on whether they should finance the hydrogen network infrastructure if they're using heat pumps or other renewable alternatives to hydrogen. And yeah, if so, then there's a good argument also to apply there some unbundling. Thinking a bit up on the other topics, yeah, on the determination of the asset transfer value. Yeah, we also looked into further detail on the different yeah, factors that would influence the value of its kind of yeah, open negotiation between a natural gas and hydrogen network operator that's not bound by any regulation. Then of course, yeah, really a number of factors come to play. Well, basically, yeah, then it's also a matter of bargaining power. Eventually, yeah, for the natural gas TSO, if the alternative is decommissioning, then yeah, also a value quite below the residual asset value may be attractive, and maybe avoiding also decommissioning costs that may arise to the natural gas TSO. And on the other hand, for the hydrogen network operator, yeah, it would just compare, or one key factor is to compare the cost of new build infrastructure, and then also reflecting on the age of the assets to be transferred. So possibly may also be willing or feasible to pay a price above the asset transfer value. So yeah, there's a number of factors to be reflected, and yeah, that also can be considered potentially also when yeah, some details on the regulatory framework are to be set. And yeah, then there was a question on incentives. So there's two countries, yeah, that's the Netherlands and France, that already have something in place. Of course, their hydrogen is not yet regulated, but to give an incentive for an actual repurposing, they actually have this sharing mechanism in place. So where part of the asset transfer value above the residual asset value is going to be shared with the natural gas TSO.
Thank you for those clarifications, Daniel, and also Benedict. And maybe I would like to refer, I think we have a question from Ivan Wierhoff, which I think partially Daniel answered, but really briefly, Daniel, on this one, on this additional one, there's a question from Torsten Kowalski, and he's referring to the role of regulators. And I think there's a part of a complaint here saying that their role might be lower than desirable, at least in some view. I don't want that we go in detail into this, but I think you can refer briefly to the discussions in the study about the competences that could be required for the process of repurposing. in 1
Yes.
minute.
Yeah. First of all, of course, there needs to be definitely additional competencies for regulators. That they maybe currently don't have. But of course, one key element, in this topic, but also the others, are the information asymmetries between the TSOs and the regulators. And it's, you need to remember that here we're really looking at individual assets. So it's individual pipeline sections, individual stations, and the kind of analysis that needs to be done, also the calculations on its value that needs to be done, can only be done by the natural gas TSO. And so the regulator then should set the framework and set detailed guidelines on what the natural gas TSO should do. And then it should review this application in very much in detail. But it cannot determine this individual assets. It's just, due to this information asymmetries, it's almost impossible to do so.
Okay, thank you, Daniel, for those clarifications. And then I would like to maybe remind, following up on that last question, I think transparency is a key point for establishing the residual asset value. And I think there, when in the report, there's a number of issues that are looked at in terms of how the asset values are set, and I think that is also important and should be part of any repurposing decision. So I invite participants to also look at the specific sections on this matter. I don't want to spend more time here. I would like to also thank again the colleagues, so Daniel, Benedikt, and Marcus, and also Wietse for their presentations. And then we will move now to the next section, which is on decommissioning and tariff increases. Weissam will be from DNB will be presenting. So the floor is yours, Weissam. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, for your time to participate in this workshop. So the next section that I am presenting will be on the regulatory decisions on decommissioning. The way we tackled this regulatory challenge, we used the same approach. First of all, we looked at the different, say, regulatory challenges and the topic to be, say, assessed for decommissioning, and we looked at different options. We assessed those and discussed those, and then we also provided some some recommendations on this. There are a number of subtopics in each of the parts, but for today's presentation, we just focus on, say, the key options that were assessed, and also focus on the key recommendations as part of the subtopics under decommissioning. So the first question to be, say, tackled for decommissioning is how to determine the individual assets to be decommissioned. A number of questions arise from this. This is related to who is responsible for determining which assets should or can be decommissioned, what competencies and responsibilities is required in order to conduct this task, and whether there would be some formal procedures and methodologies, or what criteria would need to be met in order to make this assessment. And we also look at the treatment of residual gas users. This is also similar to the part on repurposing, and whether there would be a formal regulatory approval process. The next part is then, once it has been decided that an individual asset is to be decommissioned, the next challenge is, first of all, how the stranded asset is going to be treated within the regulatory arrangements. This firstly relates to the determination of the stranded cost for this particular asset that will be decommissioned. And then secondly, what happens to this stranded asset. And thirdly, and most importantly, and I think this is the area where there is will be quite a lot of debate and discussion is the allocation of the stranded cost. Who should this be allocated to? Who should pay? Should this be the TSO? Should this be the users of the natural gas network? So this is a discussion that is quite detailed in the report. I will talk about this in the presentation in the next slides. But before that, just to cover everything, all the topics that we addressed for decommissioning. And thirdly, so if there is a case of assets to be decommissioned, there will be some additional costs that will arise. And this is related to decommissioning or dismantling costs. And these can be costs that is, if there is a legal requirement to remove the pipeline from the ground. So these will be additional costs. But in most cases, there would not really be a need to physically remove the pipeline, but there will be additional costs related to the pipeline left in the ground. And in this context, the question again is, how are these costs recovered? Is this dealt with within the regulatory framework? And also, we discussed the efficiency of these costs, so whether the TSO just submits and say these are the costs needed, and the NRA just approves this, or would there be, say, further scrutiny of these costs? So this is also discussed under decommissioning and dismantling costs. And lastly, this is from a different angle. So we're talking about decommissioning, and the first three aspects, we are looking at it from a perspective when in a case when an asset will be decommissioned, and then the associated costs and the regulatory challenges that arise in terms of who should be liable to pay these costs. But the fourth topic here, we looked at our regulatory measures to mitigate asset stranding. So this is looking at it from a point of view for that could be changes within the regulatory frameworks in order to, say, avoid asset stranding. And this is from the viewpoint of regulatory frameworks going forward. So, for example, if there is an upcoming price control or revenue setting in a particular country, there could be discussions already in whether there could be adaptations to the regulatory arrangements in the context of, say, the declining gas demand, and in the context of to mitigate or to avoid asset stranding. So this would be covered in the last topic. So first of all, before we go into the four topics, just some definitions that we have used for this study. So the first definitions, just for clarity purposes, so for stranded assets, we say these are assets which are withdrawn from operation before the end of their regulatory asset lifetime as a result of declining gas demand, technology, policy decisions such as, for example, the decarbonisation or other factors. So that is the general definition that we have applied for stranded assets for the purpose of this study. The definition that we've applied for decommissioning is the decision to withdraw a gas network asset from operation at or before the end of its regulatory lifetime, and as a result, additional decommissioning or dismantling costs may be incurred. And then in respect to stranded costs, these are the investments that a natural gas TSO has incurred. So these are the investments that have been taken with the expectations that these will be recovered under the normal regulatory conditions or framework, but now at a certain point of time may no longer be fully recoverable due to, say, unanticipated changes or circumstances. So this, in the context of this study, is in respect to the foreseeable decline of natural gas demand. So if I move on to the next slide, this is to address, say, the first topic is of when to decommission and how to identify, say, the individual assets. There's some parallels to this with the repurposing, but just to cover this for decommissioning, I'll explain some of the assessment and the discussion of things that had to, issues that had to be considered in order to assess or to decide when an individual asset can or should be decommissioned. So there's certain criteria which could be looked at, for example, is the utilization of the individual network asset. So if this has dropped permanently to zero, this could be a criteria to say, okay, this will be this part of the asset or the pipeline can be decommissioned. There's other factors. So if there is some residual use, whether this can be shifted to other pipelines or routes, or maybe there could be some additional investments needed in the infrastructure in order to still serve these the residual users of the network. Here's also some similarities to the repurposing part, but on a case-by-case basis, when, say, shifting of residual users cannot be done to other pipelines or routes. So we say on a case-by-case basis, what should be done for these residual users that cannot be shifted to say other pipelines or routes. And we looked into as part of the study, could there be some compensation to these affected users, but also not forgetting the obligation to connect part, and also the obligation of security of supply and reliability, obligations of the natural gas TSO. We also said that the natural gas TSO would be the best party to perform this analysis. We discussed, should it be the regulator, should it be a third party, but to say that for convenience and also in terms of the competencies and the tasks, the natural gas TSO would be the appropriate party to conduct this assessment for identifying potential assets to be decommissioned. But as part of the assessment, of course, this is, the word decommissioning and stranding, we understand that this is not say desirable, but it's something that has to be addressed. And we also, as part of the study, we understand that this task is not an easy task. There's lots of other factors that play a role as part of the assessment. So there should be focus on this part in terms of how to assess and what factors should be considered, not to miss anything out and not to kind of, come to the conclusion that a particular asset should be decommissioned and a thorough analysis was not conducted, because the implications of this decision is quite great. So therefore, there should be some focus on emphasis, especially at this stage. But in terms of, say, assessment, there should be other factors that should be considered as part of the assessment. So this could be, for example, demand and supply seasonality. And this means that, for example, some network assets are dimension to, say, meet peak demand in the winter, or to provide some seasonal flexibility. Also consideration of the future utilization of these individual assets. The important one is here the security and reliability stability of supply, this insurance value. So this could be that they are there to, in case of, say, any planned or unplanned interruptions, which are, say, out of the, say, normal conditions. And I think we see this now with in the case of now the disruption of the Russian gas supplies. So all these factors should also be considered as part of the assessment, and also with the role of pipelines in, say, fostering competition, i.e. making, say, markets more contestable by enabling, say, alternative entries or routes. So that is part of, say, the criteria or the methodology that should be considered when conducting this assessment to identify potential assets that will be that could be potentially decommissioned. We've also asked the question how to assess, and we also say this should be part of the network development plans. So this could be integrated in the future, and this is also similar for the repurposing aspect as well. So this would also be part of the national development plan. And in terms of the regulatory approval process, as we had mentioned, not all the NRAs are approving the NDPs of the TSOs, but as a recommendation, we for decommissioning, this should be part or defined in the regulatory framework, and then have a formal approval from the NRAs in this aspect. I'll move on to the, say, second topic is the identification of stranded costs and the recovery of these stranded costs. So this is once the assessment has been done by the gas TSO, and it has the decision is that a certain individual asset will be decommissioned. Now the big question is, first of all, how to determine the stranded cost. We had looked at different options, and we consider that the residual asset base is the best indicator or the reference value to, say, determine the stranded cost of the particular asset to be decommissioned. We also looked at the say, revaluations that have been conducted in the past, and we have also seen from the survey results and some of the case studies that in certain countries in the past, historic RAP revaluations have been conducted, and there has been different reasons why there was a RAP revaluation done. It could have been part of, say, part of the reforms, or the revaluation was conducted and to reflect that the assets reflect the true cost of service. So they applied a different, say, asset valuation methodology. But because these were done in the past and accepted, therefore any RAP revaluations are already factored in the current regulatory asset base. So therefore, we would say that the stranded cost, this is a good reference as the residual asset base. In terms of how this would be treated within the regulatory framework, the treatment of, say, the stranded assets, and also this is also part of, say, the questionnaires that were one of the questions asked to the NRAs. And this is also our recommendation, is that this stranded asset should be removed from the regulatory asset base. What is the implication of this? This would therefore mean that because it's removed from the regulatory asset base, there would no longer be a return or rate of return earned on this stranded asset, and also hello, I kind of lost everyone.
I think now you're.
I'm
I
back
can hear
again.
you. Yeah, I can
Sorry,
hear
You are
you
back.
perfectly.
sorry. I got disconnected. Yeah, so going back, so therefore a depreciation allowance would no longer be earned within the regulatory framework. The next issue is then, is there any compensation? How is this going to be just a loss for the TSO, or should there be some mechanisms within the regulatory framework to account for this? So this is one of the, say, the debates of who pays. And first of all, one of the main, say, arguments you could say, or for, say, full recovery, is because when the TSO or the natural gas TSO made the investment of a particular asset, and this was approved by, say, the NRA, depending on the regulatory regime on how investments approvals are made. But assuming the TSO did its analysis, it made its forecast, it provided alternatives for a particular asset, and this was therefore approved. And it was justified at that time point. But now, because of conditions that have changed, it now puts the natural gas TSO at risk in terms of recovery because of, say, the decline of natural gas demand. But then on the other side of the argument, you could say, but then why should natural gas users be paying for an asset that are no longer in use? So this is, say, what is part of the stranding debate, and this highly relates to the implications of the stranding debate. We have some examples, of, say, some regulatory treatment that is applied or could be applied. So there could be a one-off adjustment, and this could be in the form of depreciation, or, say, the OPEX of the stranded cost. But of course, this has implications on the tariff, because the tariff would this would be reflected in the tariff. Of course, it's no longer in the regulatory asset base, and there's no return or depreciation allowance. But then this chunk of, say, the stranded cost, depending on the age of the asset, will have implications on the tariff.
We have just wanted to tell you, we have 5 minutes left. Just so
Okay,
you know.
right.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. So yeah. So in this part is kind of one of the areas where there's more debate, and yeah, and who should be liable, who should pay. We also discuss whether government or taxpayers should bear or bear partly of the stranded cost, because it's driven by decarbonisation targets. But in the end, because this is the NRA and the TSOs do not really have big influence on government budgets. This, as part of the study, we're looking at regulatory solutions, or so therefore we recommend that there should be recovery, whether there should be sharing mechanism. We feel that at this stage we cannot indicate in one direction or the other, so therefore we would have there should be additional analysis for each individual regulatory regime. Okay, I'll move on to the dismantling costs. I tried to do this one quicker because I think the last slide is more interesting. So this is related to the cost when there's an asset is going to be decommissioned. So whether these should be part of the allowed revenues. We say that there should be a cost assessment and approval of efficient decommissioning and dismantling costs, regardless of whether it's physical removal of the pipeline from the ground or it's left in the ground. There would be, if it's left in the ground, there would be some ongoing costs and checks and maintenance. We don't think this should be part of the general efficiency assessment, but therefore a separate cost assessment by the NRA, and therefore as part of this process, the natural gas TSO should list and submit these associated costs for each of the activity in order for the NRA to make an assessment. A suggestion could be also that the natural gas TSO does a public tender to get competing offers for decommissioning work, and this should also help with the transparency and the assessment. And then again, also who pays, whether it's shared. We feel this could be further analysed, but the important part is on the efficiency of these costs. This is the last slide, and this one is I think is also very interesting, and because this is looking at adapting parameters within the regulatory framework going forward. So these are some of the options that were assessed. So we have a depreciation policy, changes to the RAP methodology, and adapting the WACC. So when we're talking about adapting parameters, when we're looking at the building blocks or the components of setting the allowed revenues, you have the OPEX, you have the regulatory asset base, you have the rate of the return, and the depreciation. So therefore, we're not looking at OPEX, it's not relevant in this case. So we're looking at whether there are possibilities to change the methodology of the WACC or the RAP methodology or depreciation policy in light of this decarbonisation targets and the decline of natural gas demand. So first of all, with the depreciation policy, typically the assets are depreciated on a straight line basis. So this means it has an asset life, and this is just divided by the regulatory asset base is divided by the asset life, and the asset is depreciated in equal amounts throughout the duration of the asset. But because based on the scenarios that the natural gas demand is expected in the future, and the issue is of recovering the costs from the TSO. One option was looking at, say, front-loaded, or also called accelerated depreciation. So this means moving from, say, a straight line depreciation method, that it would be more that in the beginning of the asset life, bigger amounts are depreciated. So therefore, this is recovered quicker. This is one of the assumptions for, say, front-loaded depreciation. A second option is also to reduce the asset life. So typically, the pipeline asset lifetime can be from 50 to 60 years, but an option could be to reduce this, so the recovery is made. But with the reducing asset life, it's more an attempt to avoid stranding by providing the recovery before it occurs, if that makes sense. But both these options, front-loaded or reducing the asset life, is to increase the certainty in the cost recovery in the short to medium term. So this means that the recovery is shifted forwards, and this is based on the assumption that there are currently more users of the gas network now than in the future. So therefore, the cost can be depreciated to more users. One important thing here is that the amount of the allowed revenues are not reduced. It's just the timing of when the recovery is made. Furthermore, we also saw that in some countries they just have targeted depreciation, where they say, oh, by a certain year the regulatory asset base will be fully depreciated, for example, by 2045 or 2050. So they don't use, say, they don't change the way the asset is depreciated. They just target the depreciation. Secondly, we also looked at whether there could be changes to the RAP methodology, and the RAP revaluation was also looked at as a way to as a possible way to mitigate against stranding. Here, there wasn't a lot of regulatory precedents, but also in the context, as I had said before, there has been RAP revaluation done in the past, and the reasons differ, but this was part of a consultation process. But to have RAP revaluation in the context to mitigate against stranding and to first of all, it'd be like what methodology could be applied, and would this be done in a mechanical way? And if this is done mechanically, this has some issues with this. So this is something that we do not propose. Second option that we had looked at, which is then also relates to the rate of return, is the non-indexation of the regulatory asset base. This might already be applied in some countries, but for other reasons. But we just as an option. So if there was non-indexation of the regulatory asset base, then this has to be offset by having a nominal weighted average cost of capital. So this means that the inflation element is covered in the weighted average cost of capital. So the compensation is for inflation is reflected in the capital cost in the respective year by the so this is reflected in the nominal WACC. We also looked at whether there could be a WACC premium it's not really to mitigate against stranding. It's more as a premium to reflect, say, stranding risk. But this is more detailed in the report, and there's some issues that we draw out on whether there should be an asset better uplift or whether there should be an individual risk premium to the cost of equity. But this is kind of also set out in the report. I know that we're running out of time, so I think I will stop here. But I'm happy to answer questions. I know this is a very, say, controversial and lively debate.
Thank you, Wisam. I think we have a number of questions that we will bring after Claude's session. I will now give the floor to, thanks for the very detailed presentation also. Claude, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, ACER, for inviting me. So Claude Mangin and SOG, I have two slides, one on stranded asset and one on stranded cost. So stranded asset. So I put again the DNV definition, but what does it mean, stranded asset? Is it a low or zero utilization rate? For how long? And even these simple criteria will raise a lot of questions, as expressed by DNV also. First, the liberalization of the market. The 20 years of liberalization, we move from a one flow pattern from the import monopoly to multiple flows and competition. And so we increase the entry capacity of an entry-exit zone, and it's more than it's more than the demand and the consumption of that zone. But it's not, of course, used at the same time. And this gives flexibility to have competition and a better price on the gas wholesale price. And as you mentioned, also to fill the storage. And it gives flexibility to the system, how we experience nowadays. We shift, for instance, from a post-Fukushima time where there was no LNG coming to Europe to more and more LNG. But of course, there are some bottlenecks, and we are building new regasification terminal because it's not so easy to replace the main supplier of Europe in such a short time. But this give you a good example of the flexibility of the system and that it's difficult to to discuss what is stranded or not. And then, yeah, what will be the future after the war in Ukraine? That's also difficult. You have the Repower EU study who says we have to import 10 million tons of hydrogen. We are importing more LNG, but this is more for the short term, and we are shifting the gas flow from east to west, and now we are moving from west to east. That's why yeah, again, it's tricky to have criteria, and would yeah, this need further discussion, and we need to have a precautionary criteria yeah, to try to evaluate what is stranded. And let's say that the gas network is less used. Our way to move for the future would be that we repurpose that pipe, those assets to flow hydrogen, pure hydrogen, and or we keep the natural gas network, and we are injecting more and more biomethane, and we want to decarbonize yeah, the gas sector. That's why our solution, we support repurposing of gas infrastructure to transport hydrogen. It's the most efficient, efficient than building new hydrogen network. And we are not going to decommission a gas pipeline and build a brand new hydrogen network. But yeah, it needs further discussion. Then, if we end up by having a decommissioning, yeah, DNV mentioned the stranded cost. So we agree on some element that gas TSO are best placed, and we'll have question in the chat. We'll discuss that in a minute. We also agree that the residual value of the asset to be decommissioned should be the reference to value those stranded asset costs. But what we would like to say is that we should recoup our full investment cost, and we are not taking a stranded asset risk, and so we should not bear potential decommissioning and dismantling costs for stranded asset. This is we are not changing the regulatory framework while we are during the lifetime of the investment. And this, my last point, is related to that. We can discuss in the last slide of DNV adjusting the depreciation policy, but we really think we should not touch, we should not have a capital shortfall, and we should not change the RAB valuation methodology and the WACC. And as I say, yeah, this workshop is only the first discussion of this topic, complex topic that I guess we are going to discuss more and more. Thank you.
Thank you, Claude, for that presentation. I think you provide there, let's say, a preliminary or a point of view there that I guess you have discussed with your TSOs. I think this is a complex issue, and I think at this stage we don't have, as we initially said, the certainty about the size of the issue, whether it would happen at some point or not, is quite uncertain. So this makes the discussion a bit theoretical at this stage, but nevertheless we wanted to introduce it to start building the tools, not only to address the problem, but to assess the problem. And I think this is where we stand, and I think there we appreciate also your views here. I would have a couple of questions that I want to address. I would ask you to be as brief as possible on this one, as we're a bit late on time. A question for both of you, Wysam and Claude, is about who can identify the assets that could potentially be decommissioned. And I think, Wysam, you've referred to the TSO in your presentation, and there's a question from the Hungarian NRA requesting or asking if the TSO is in the right position, given that it would have an interest not to decommission assets. And then Tara Connolly from Global Witnesses also refers to this question. So I think it's quite an important one, let's say the neutrality of the TSO to complete this assessment. And maybe the second one, Wisam, that I would like maybe to bring to you is whether the removal of an asset from the RAB would give the right indication for investments, not only in natural gas, but also in hydrogen. Just, I think if you could just indicate your views in about a minute or a bit more if needed, but just very briefly. Thank you.
Okay. Shall I start or?
Okay, yeah, Claude, go ahead with the first question, maybe.
Yeah, so what prevents us of building and laying a new pipeline? It's the regulation, it's the rule we've put in place. Else we will build pipeline to increase our RAB. And for decommissioning, it's the same process. We are consulting the market, we are consulting the NRA, but then it's assets that are belonging to our companies, and that's why we are the one taking the final investment decision. And that's the point I would like to make. If we decommission, it's our books that we are going to remove those assets, and it's the final one who decide should be the company to whom those assets belongs. But of course, yeah, there is a regulation and a regulatory framework to prevent the conflict of interest that were mentioned in the question. Then, yeah, you can continue. And,
yeah, just drawing on from what Claude is just saying in terms of like, when you're looking at investments, the TSO is the decision maker, or provides the frame, provides, say, the justification why a particular investment is needed. So the TSO has the competencies, and they have, they should be conducting their own, say, supply demand forecasts. This is in terms of investments. But if you're looking at decommissioning, we also look at, okay, they should be looking at, say, utilization, certain parts of the pipeline. So they already have this, say, competencies, and they have this information, and therefore they should be the ones doing the assessment, and then they should also provide their justification and reasoning. We say it should be part of, let's say, the network development plan, and for the NRA to assess and approve the proposals from the TSO. And of course, the assessment part, when we were talking about all these different factors that need to be considered, is not an easy part. And it's not really, we say, oh, it's not, we want to encourage assets to be decommissioned, but I think this is going to be a reality in the, because we are talking about it, so it's important. So therefore, that is why there's more focus on, say, the TSO to conduct this assessment. But of course, it should be, certain criteria. They should consider different factors. So as part of the assessment before a final decision is to be taken. And then going back to Miguel, you said the question about why to remove stranded assets from the regulatory asset base. Does it send the correct signals to investments? Of course, investors are looking at the regulatory asset base, but the regulatory, say, framework and also the principles is that you should not be, if an asset is not used anymore, it shouldn't be part of the regulatory asset base, in the sense there shouldn't be a return earned on this. But in terms of saying signals to the investors, the regulatory framework and the design of the regulatory framework should provide a signal to the investors of how, say, this industry is being regulated. So that's my quick response there.
yeah, on that one, I'm not sure I get the question. It's, of course, removal of asset from the RAB is not an investment. It's not a good, nice investment signal. But yeah, we are an industry that are able to adapt. We move from town manufacture gas to natural gas, and the next evolution would be to move to renewable and low carbon gases, who could be flowing in a dedicated hydrogen network or blended or biomethane. And so it's part of any business to evolve. And yeah, you are decommissioning some parts, but you are building new parts. So.
Thank you for your contribution and your answers to these 2 points, Wissam and Claude. I think we also had some follow-up points which we can't address now about also the side of users who ultimately pay for the assets when they use them. I think these aspects are reflected in the study, well reflected actually. So I would invite you to maybe take a look at the report if you're further interested. We're also available to further continue this discussion. So if you find that some points are not addressed or require further views, we can happily address those points, and you can contact either DNB or ourselves. Thank you to both. We will now move to the next section on what we've labeled reinvestment. I think maybe this is a category that maybe is not familiar to all the participants. I think Rosaria will now explain to us what this is about. Yeah, we look forward to the presentation. Rosaria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miguel. I'm going to present the third topic today, which is reinvestments and extended use of assets. So natural gas transmission assets will reach the end of the regulatory asset life in the coming years, when the gas demand will still remain at a higher level. Therefore, NRAs will need to assess the choice between replacing existing assets, which we call reinvestments, or keeping the assets in operation after the end of the regulatory asset life. The reinvestments, they can be of the same size or smaller size, which depends on the long-term utilization of the networks. And the reinvestments have also implications on repurposing and stranded assets, because reinvestments can be made in a way that they can be used for the transport of hydrogen or biomethane, as my colleagues already explained. And on the other hand, if there are reinvestments, there is also a risk that these assets might become stranded, particularly taking into account that there is uncertainty about the natural gas demand in the coming years. The other option would be to keep fully depreciated assets in operation after the end of the regulatory life. Obviously, this could be possible when technically feasible and safe. This depends on the maintenance activities that the TSO carries out, and it's also related with how the regulatory asset life is defined, which typically relates with the concepts of technical asset life and economic asset life. If we consider these two options, it's relatively obvious that keeping assets in operation after the end of the regulatory asset life, when this is technically feasible and safe, could postpone and avoid reinvestment, which is a positive thing. However, there are some issues related with this, because the natural gas TSOs typically have an incentive to replace the assets after the end of the regulatory asset life, because the capital cost would be zero, instead of taking some asset maintenance or more OPEX, let's say, solutions. So this is the well-known bias towards CapEx intensive solutions. And in addition, there is also the issue of asymmetric information between the TSOs and NRAs. Typically, TSOs have much more information, and they could justify a replacement or decide to replace some assets based on risks or potential failures of the network. And NRAs would be in a difficult situation to not approve such reinvestments. We are going to look into 4 regulatory areas where NRAs could play a role, and this will be presented in the coming slides. and also we will look briefly into some regulatory tools that are important when decided between reinvestments or keeping fully depreciated assets in operation. Now, in the next slide, I just want to show quickly how relevant is this issue. So we also provide in the report additional graphs and figures, but basically what the key message is really that there is an increasing role of asset replacement as part of the total TSO investments, and this kind of trend is likely to increase in the coming years due to the fact that assets become fully depreciated. Now looking more into the regulatory areas that I mentioned before, one is the adaptation of the regulatory asset life, which basically determines the regulatory depreciation. What we have seen is that the regulatory practice has been to assign a standard regulatory life to each category of assets, and this relates with the expected economic or technical life. But also we have seen that the expected lives in some cases may be conservative because many assets remain in place beyond the expected lives. So as a general rule, we would say that the depreciation allowance should be based as close as possible to the technical life to avoid that unnecessary costs are passed through to the transmission network users. We kind of think about, okay, what should we do then with existing assets and new assets with regards to the regulatory asset lives? For existing assets, changing to new, let's say, longer regulatory depreciation lives is a possibility. However, it's not something that we recommend because this could undermine regulatory certainty and also predictability of the regulatory framework. And there is also an increased risk of asset stranding, as also my colleague Vaison mentioned before. For new assets that are expected to be used and useful for the whole of its technical life, then the recommendation is that the regulatory depreciation should be equal to the expected technical life. And in this case, the current regulatory asset lives could be adjusted if NRAs believe that they need to do so. On contrary, if new assets are expected to be operational for longer than they will be used and useful, then the recommendation is that further consideration should be given whether to replace this asset. And so we could think of alternative ways of supplying this, the respective natural gas transmission users in this case. A second area where NRAs could potentially play a role is with regards to changes to the regulatory assessment and remuneration of reinvestments. So in a context of decarbonization, additional regulatory scrutiny could be applied by NRAs for reinvestments. This requires, in some cases, a change to the national legislation to give more powers to NRAs to approve the investment plans. This has also been mentioned by my colleagues before. For large reinvestments, we suggest that NRAs could request cost-benefit analysis to compare, in this case, a set of options, so reinvesting or replacing versus keeping the asset in operation after the end of the regulatory asset life. And in addition, detailed explanations of the need of the replacement should be required by NRAs, and potentially this could be provided by independent third parties. For smaller reinvestments, and because CBIs are time and resources intensive processes, it is recommended, we recommend that NRAs could develop some simplified CBA processes, and the exact format and details of this cost benefit analysis simplified processes, they still need to be developed in future work. The next area where regulators could also do something relates with the treatment of assets that are fully depreciated, but they are still in operation. There are two main possibilities. So the NRAs can decide to provide an OPEX allowance only for keeping fully depreciated assets in operation. So obviously, if the asset is kept in operation after the end of the regulatory asset life, there still needs to be, or it requires operating and maintenance costs, potentially even higher. These solutions, so solutions more related with higher OPEX, are not so attractive for TSOs, as I mentioned in the beginning. So what can happen is that natural gas TSOs might decide to replace the assets and justify this as there are risks or there are some potential failures of the networks. So they could decide for this. So the alternative would be to provide an explicit financial incentive for maintaining fully depreciated assets in operation. And this financial incentive would be in addition to the OPEX allowance, as I mentioned before. This financial incentive would basically be an element in the regulatory formula to determine the allowed revenues, so an additional kind of element. If NRAs decided to go for this option, then a CBA could be a prerequisite to make sure that really the best decision has been taken. With regards to the amount of the financial incentive, there are several possibilities. We indicate, for instance, to provide some increased OPEX allowance. So instead of giving the standard allowance, OPEX allowance, there could be some premium on it, an additional OPEX allowance or increased OPEX allowance, or there could be also the case that this financial incentive is determined based on a percentage or a part of the capital costs. This sort of financial incentives should be reassessed over time, for example, at the end of the regulatory period, and its application should be limited in time. And whenever possible, a best practice is for NRAs to consult on the details of the design of these financial incentives to get the views of all stakeholders considered. So as a key idea here is that NRAs could indeed apply these explicit financial incentives for keeping fully depreciated assets in operation, and we suggest that this could be the case when a TOTEX approach would not be feasible. And so I will speak about this in the next slide. So these two slides are interrelated somehow. So another regulatory area that we also describe in our report is related with changes to the regulatory models. We mentioned that there are this issue of information asymmetries, and NRAs, it's difficult for NRAs to not approve some replacement investments when there are risks related with security of supply or reliability. So one option would be, as I mentioned before, to introduce some kind of additional financial incentive, but there is also another option, which is the one described in this slide, which is the adoption of some form of TOTEX approach instead of dealing separate with capital and operational expenditures. Obviously, we see that in many practical cases, conducting economic benchmarking on total costs, meaning including also capital costs, is not easy. There are some issues related with data limitations, different accounting conventions in the treatment of capital costs. So in many cases, it's difficult to compare apples to apples. And in general, also the adoption of a TOTEX approach would represent a change from the current regulatory practice. So this would require further work from NRAs. So as a key message here, we suggest that when feasible, NRAs may apply a TOTEX approach to mitigate the issue of asymmetric information between natural gas TSOs and NRAs. However, we want to highlight that the regulatory model needs to be really tailored to the specific situation in the country. And this depends on several factors like the institutional capacity of the NRAs, the main issues and challenges that TSOs face, the stage of the gas network, gas market development, the interaction between the different incentives and regulatory incentives that are within the regulatory framework, and so on and so forth. So it's really up to the NRAs to take the decision, although we provide here our view. So these are the main regulatory areas that I mentioned. And also in the first slide, I anticipated that there are some regulatory tools that facilitate the efficient choice between reinvestments and extended use of assets. One refers to the forecast of natural gas demand and network planning. Obviously, accurate natural gas forecasting is really a prerequisite to determine future investment requirements. If the reinvestment or the investments are overestimated, it's very likely that there are some reinvestments that will be made and they could have been avoided. And this is really scenario dependent and also policy driven. Therefore, we consider important that the decarbonization policies and respective timings are clearly defined in the national level, at the national level, so that this can be seen as an input in the natural gas forecasts. With regards to network planning, we would like to emphasize that it's really important to have some more integrated network planning and operation, considering the entire EU energy system. And this is, for example, in the case of reinvestment that can be made in a way that a pipeline, for instance, can be repurposed to transport hydrogen, for instance. It's very important that the network planning is coordinated and integrated, considering all really energy carriers, infrastructures, and the consumption sectors. And in some cases, also important to consider alternative ways of supplying network users, not only going for, let's say, the option of reinvesting and considering, for example, if electrification or demand response are better options. The second regulatory tool is related with maintenance. So it's a little bit also clear that one way to defer reinvestments or capital expenditures is to improve maintenance. One idea is for TSOs to prepare and publish an asset management plan that could define the maintenance strategy, aiming at achieving the optimal trade-off between maintenance and replacement costs. When feasible, we suggest that conditional-based assessments could be adopted rather than age-based replacement programs. And also natural gas TSOs could apply monetized risk assessments that are currently being applied in UK, I believe. So basically assessing current and future risks of natural gas transmission network with and without investment, the expected frequency of asset failures and their consequences in monetary terms. The final, last but not least, also it's important to increase transparency requirements and taking into account the importance of reinvestments in the total TSO investments, we believe it's important to define and publish indicators to monitor really the evolution of reinvestments and also assets that are fully depreciated in operation. These information requirements could be either included at the EU level or at the national level. In this case, would be defined by NRAs. And yeah, with this, I conclude my presentation. I think, Miguel, you are muted.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks for that. So thank you, Rosaria, for your presentation. Again, very interesting on this topic. I hope it brings a bit of awareness on the topic we're looking at. Especially interesting were those graphs that you brought at the beginning that shows that this discussion about reinvestments will kind of pick up largely in the coming times. I would like maybe now to present or introduce our colleague Caterina Miriello from ARERA, so the Italian regulator, and she will present us with the discussion in Italy, where I think this topic has been consulted recently. So I think the NRA is quite on top of this discussion. So Caterina, thanks again for presenting today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miguel. Yes, in Italy, we have thought a lot about the topic of reinvestment for a simple fact, because the Italian gas pipelines is very old, and we are facing a moment in which several pipelines are almost fully depreciated. But they're still fit to be maintained in operation. So the TSO has represented to us this situation, and we have asked the TSO to provide to us a detailed data set of the conditions of the network, and we have conducted extended analysis about the network. And together with the operator, we have tried the TSO. We have tried to find some solution in order to avoid a massive substitution of the network. Here I reported, I repeat a lot of, in the slide there, I repeated a lot of concepts that have been very well explained by DNB presentation. I will not go through them again. I think that the audience at this stage has grasped the main concept. Anyway, we tried to do some simulations of the costs and benefits of postponing an investment, even though after a few years, in the context of the decarbonization, this investment may be I'd say useless, or at least not so useful as today. And we have found in our simulations with several demand scenarios and several decarbonization scenarios intended as like an end of gas in 2050, 2060, that postponing the substitution of the investment brings a benefit to the system, even in the case that this substitution is no longer needed, the asset is no longer needed before the end of the technical life. And so we came up with some with a set of regulatory measures that are not yet fully implemented. We started to increase the oversight on TSO investments in trying to lessen the information asymmetry. The first measure that we adopted has been to include substitution investment in NDPs, even if they're justified by safety reasons. So we tried to, in this way, we are able to control, at least with the CBA analysis, if the investment brings a benefit to the system. And then this year we also introduced a methodology that we asked the TSO to develop, that has been called the asset health methodology, that is under consultations in these days, and it is certified by a third party, an independent third party of experts, and will be used to evaluate the status, the health of the asset. So we'll evaluate the need for substitution or the possibility of reinvestment in the asset, so of postponing the substitution and reinvesting in the asset. The second measure that we adopted has been the introduction of an incentive mechanism to postpone a substitution investment when this is, of course, technically feasible at the sole judgment of the TSO. We cannot say. We don't have the technical ability or the knowledge to say if an investment may be postponed or not. So this decision lies to the TSO, is a responsibility of the TSO. We have estimated, tried to estimate what may be this incentive by calculating a sort of benefit for the system of avoided remuneration. So we made some simulations, and we created a model with different decarbonization scenarios, and we estimated which is the benefit of the system of this postponement of the investment, and apply the share a share of this benefit. So parts of this, which is 50% at the moment, it's still under consultation. So part of the half of the benefit lies in stays for the system, and the other half is given to the TSO as an incentive. And the third measure, which is still under consultation, is the possibility to capitalize the extraordinary maintenance expenses with a shorter regulatory life with respect to pipelines. So we have hypothesized our regulatory life for this kind of I would say virtual asset that maybe 15 or 20 years, and in this case, up to a certain threshold, which we have for now identified as 10%, the TSO can capitalize extraordinary maintenance expenses, which are not substitutions. So this is the set of measures that we have identified, and this consultation is still in progress. We have finished the consultation about the incentive, so we will come up with a decision, with a resolution I think before the end of 2022, and at the beginning of next year, we hope to have a consistent regulation to help us address this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caterina, for that. I think I have a follow-up immediate question from Luis Parada asking if the measures that you're referring to are part of the consultation that you carried out, I think.
Sorry?
So you're muted. So if the measures that you're referring to are part of the consultation that you were referring to.
Okay, so we have several consultations going on. The incentive has been part of the new regulatory period for transportation, but has also been part of another dedicated consultation document. And the same. Yes.
Sorry, Caterina, they ask about whether this is included in the consultation on the ROS approach.
Sorry, I didn't hear. No, because the ROS approach is something that it's not specific about the transmission, the gas transmission sector, but it's general. It's a set of general guidelines for all the sectors, the regulated sectors of gas and electricity. So this is not part of the ROS consultation.
Okay, thanks for the clarification, Caterina. Then we have another question also from Luis Parada. It's Enagas, so it's a Spanish TSO, and it's about the regulatory asset life and how it matches the technical asset life. And we understand that there's assets that can last for quite some time. And what the question refers to is that it could be quite dysfunctional from an economic point of view to have such long depreciation times. It could be 70 to 90 years. This is an interesting question. I would address it to Rosaria because we've looked at this in the section that she has presented. And maybe it's interesting to refer that in some cases, I mean, the depreciations are quite different across TSOs, and some are about 30 years, whereas I think from memory, for the Swedish TSO, it's up to 70 or 80 years. So maybe, if, Rosaria, if you could give us some insights about how, from an economic point of view, how this is important, and also the follow-up would be what happens if the depreciation is shorter and you replace an asset. What's the outcome? If you replace an asset with a shorter depreciation, what would be the outcome? So maybe that question would be for Rosaria. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Miguel, and thanks for the question. It's indeed relevant, and we discussed this quite a lot, also with ACER. In particular, this is also addressed in the report in further details. Indeed, today I did not provide much information, but in general, the regulatory asset life should consider the technical life, but also the economic life. And the economic life can be shorter than the technical life, but not the other way around. And there are some concerns on the economic life that should be taken into account. If I'm not mistaken, in Spain, for instance, considerations have been taken with regards to the issue that when the TSO goes to the banks, it cannot be that they say, okay, the regulatory asset life is 100 or 90 years, because this is not possible or not acceptable for commercial banks, and that would be already an issue. So we understand that, and in general, our view is that both concepts should be considered and integrated when NRAs decide on the regulatory asset life. However, it's important, as Miguel mentioned, to have a reflection on this, because if we look, there is also a table in the report where we have the regulatory asset lives for pipelines and compressor stations for the different countries, and we see that they are quite different. So we are not really judging whether they are correct or whether it does not make sense that the regulatory asset life is shortened. However, when this happens, when the NRA decides to shorten the regulatory asset life compared to the technical life for a certain reason, this should also be taken into account when a decision of a reinvestment is made, in the sense that if the regulatory asset life is relatively short compared, let's say, to an average or asset life, then we would have a risk that after 10 years, a new reinvestment has to be done, and the old asset is still in good conditions to be kept in operation. So this is the thing. NRAs and TSOs should have this in mind.
Thank you for that clarification, Rosaria, and the answer to the question. We have another question from Robert Bandergest, and in terms of referring to the need of mechanisms to address this problem of the lifetime extensions of the assets in the upcoming times. It's quite a generic question. What I would invite is to go through the report. As Rosaria explained, there's a number of options that are detailed. Maybe I can give you the floor shortly for this, Rosaria. You can repeat a bit. There's a number of options that the section considers for extending assets. If you want, Rosaria, you can wrap it up. In what ways you foresee the extension of the assets or this choice? I know it's a kind of a broad question, but if you can just wrap it up, what are the options that you have to extend assets, and you could refer also to the report briefly.
Yeah. No, indeed. I mean, one aspect that I would like maybe to highlight that is also referred in the report and that has not been mentioned here today is about the fact that, okay, if we consider that the asset life is, say, about 40 or 50 years, and we see that in practice, this after this 40 or 50 years regulatory asset life, this asset can still be kept in operation. I mean, it's still technically feasible and safe. What's important is that after the end of this number of years, a technical review is done, and potential some independent party says that, okay, this asset is still in good conditions to be kept in operation, so that NRAs have the comfort that there will not be risks, and also TSOs are in a place that they have to accept that if the asset is still in good conditions, it should be kept in operation, so that we avoid this bias towards capex intensive solutions, as it's also well described in the literature. So this technical review is important, and it's something that should also maybe be considered in the regulatory framework.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rosaria. Thanks a lot for that. I would maybe, I think there's an interesting question in the chat. I don't know if the colleagues from the Commission are around. I think it's about the need of including some of these conclusions or reference to problems that have been discussed here in the gas decarbonization package. If they are around, they can turn on the camera, otherwise, and give me an indication that exactly here. So I see Marcus is around. So the question is about whether some of these issues can be included in the current discussions on the gas decarbonization package, because Michaela Hall argues that they could be relevant, especially in the current context of the crisis. There could be a bit more relevant. So I think you previously referred to this, but if you could maybe say a word again.
Yes, I think we had the topic at the beginning of the session already on where we are in the negotiations. We are quite advanced. The Czech presidency announced that they are still targeting a general approach by the end of the year. Whether this will be possible, we will have to see, but we are very well advanced in the negotiation as such. In this regard, it is unfortunately not possible for me to say in how far it would be possible to actually now put in anything from, let's say, the identified issues in the package or not. That's not possible for me to say, but what I can say is, of course, that we take a close look, and we look with interest on the results of the study and the questions related to that, because whatever the final package will look like, it is quite reasonable to follow up, or it is quite reasonable to expect that we will need to follow up on several of these topics when implementing it in the end. So I know this reply might not be so satisfying, but this is all what I can say at that moment in time.
Thank you, Marcus. Thanks for joining at this time. And then I would like to maybe close this section. Thank you, Katerina, and thank you, Rosaria, for your very helpful insights. I would like maybe now to give the floor. So with this, I think we close the three sections that are the core of the report. I would like maybe to extend again the invitation to take a look at the document, because it's quite detailed, and we're quite I'd say happy with how it addresses really a large number of topics. So we really invite you to look at it if the topics are of your interest. I would like now to pass the floor to Chila, who will provide some closing remarks. Chila, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Miguel. We really hope that you enjoyed the webinar. We have seen many questions and we are very, very grateful for them. I would like specifically to thank the speakers, Danielle, Vaisum, Rosaria from DNV, the EC speakers, and also our NRA colleagues, Katerina and Wietse, as well as Claude from NSOG. We note that there are many topics that you are interested in, and I would just kind of highlight a few that were appearing also in the chat and in the discussion. So there is kind of a discussion and an interest in how we should treat the asset value and the asset lives. That's a very interesting topic, and we will continue work on it. There were other elements that are quite critical, which comes with the information asymmetry that is between TSOs and NRAs. And so, of course, there is a challenge here. What is the level of transparency that is provided, and what kind of powers the NRAs have to manage this situation? And then there were some other interesting comments here and there about whether we can have other alternatives beyond the ones that the DNB looked at. I would repeat what Miguel said. The report is very, very informative. I encourage you to read it, maybe by section, maybe by also of your sort of angle of interest. The authors put a great emphasis in making this very technical report readable, and we intending it to be accessible for multiple audiences. So please visit our website and take a look at the report. Looking further and towards the future, we believe that the study could be used for several work streams. We see that in some countries you have a couple of discussions about reinvestment in gas assets. So in that sense, this study could help providing some regulatory aspects for that. We believe that the repurposing questions will come closer to us, especially once the hydrogen and gas decarbonization package is adopted. And then the decommissioning aspects would be something that would appear maybe on the longer term horizon. Nevertheless, I think it's important that there is a discussion about it. When it comes to the package, we are hoping that some aspects would be interesting to be carried and picked up. The ones that I would mention is about like what is the asset transfer value, for example. Maybe there could be elements that could allow some inspiration picked from the study. What is the level of transparency when it comes to the regulated asset base? That would be also important, maybe to take care of, and so how the TSO costs are provided for. And then we also believe, and we consider, at least on our end, when it comes to new network codes and the establishment of framework guideline, we would also rely on the study and we would use them. There is an ongoing work at ACER on the implementation on TENI, and we also think that the study could inform a couple of regulatory questions there. More generically speaking, what we find important and what our learning is from this study, that the NRA independence is key, and it's also key that the NRAs have appropriate staffing to manage and to continue managing these very complex issues. The transparency aspects are very key in this discussion in order to bring for cost-effective solutions. And with that, I would like to say goodbye. I really, really thank you for being present today and being so active and using the chat and also having discussions within the chat. So very many thanks. And I'm hoping that we would see you in our other webinars that would come along. And I wish you a great continuation of the day. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you very much from DNB side. Goodbye.
Many thanks to DNV. Goodbye to all. And also many thanks to the colleagues at ACER making this webinar a success. Many thanks. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.